Club. This is a bit irregular today because we have a larger than usual audience, and we also have a candidates debate for United States Senate position. The future of the city, of course, I'm Jim Westwood, your president. The future of the city is at the heart of City Club, but today the future not only of the city but of the state of Oregon, the region, the country, and perhaps even broader horizons are also at stake. Today we have the opportunity to hear about the views, the plans, and the vision of two Democrat primary candidates for United States Senate. With us today are the two frontrunners in that race, AuCoin and Harry Lonsdale. A third candidate, Joe Wetzel, was not invited to appear today. The program will have four discrete sections. First, each candidate will give a 5-minute opening statement. A coin toss held earlier this week determined the order of appearance, and Harry Lonsdale will be going first. Following the opening statements, candidates will respond to questions from a panel of two City Club members seated directly in front of me. Panelists are Mary McWilliams, Chief Executive Officer of the Sisters of Providence Health Plans, and Bill Crane, Executive Director of the Portland Baroque Orchestra. They are both members of the City Club's Program Committee. Questions were submitted in advance of the meeting today by City Club members, and a special subcommittee of the City Club Program Committee has selected the questions to be asked today. Those are the only questions which will be asked. Departing from our usual format, we will not have questions from members on the floor today. The candidates have not seen these questions in advance. Each candidate will have 1 minute to respond once the questioner completes asking the question. And our timer, seated also at the front table today, and presumably counting for knockdowns at the bell, is Jolene Clausen, also a member of our program committee. Following the panel questions, we'll have cross questions from each candidate. That is, each candidate will be allowed to ask questions of the other. They'll ask 3 questions each. 30 seconds will be allotted for the asking of the question, and the respondent will have 1 minute. Then the person who asked the question will have 30 seconds to rebut. Following that cross-questioning, we'll return to our City Club panel for a series of questions, which will be followed then, in conclusion, by a 3-minute closing from each of the candidates. The meeting is governed by that format I just described and by the rules of conduct that are on each of your tables. This program will adjourn at or shortly before 1 p.m. The last time a Democrat represented Oregon in the United States Senate, Lyndon Johnson was president, Woodstock hadn't happened yet, and we were all 23 years younger. But if current polls are an accurate prediction, there will be a close contest in November between Oregon Senator Bob Packwood, a Republican running for his 4th term, and one of the two Democrats who will be addressing you today, AuCoin and Harry Lonsdale. Harry Lonsdale burst onto Oregon's political scene in 1990, winning the Democratic Party nomination to challenge Senator Mark Hatfield. As those of you who were here then will recall, he campaigned aggressively. He closed the gap to a dead heat in the last 2 weeks before the election, and he came within an ace of defeating Senator Hatfield, who hadn't lost an election in 40 years of public service. Mr. Lonsdale's career has largely been in business. He founded a high-technology research and development company in Bend in 1975, and today it has about 70 employees. In the 1990 election, Mr. Lonsdale was reported to have spent $750,000 of his own money on his campaign. AuCoin also has roots in Central Oregon, having grown up in Redmond. He worked as a journalist and a public information officer until 1974, when he won election to Congress from Oregon's 1st Congressional District and was the first Democrat ever to represent that district. He's been there since, and he's now completing his 9th term. He's served on, but has yet to chair, various House committees, including the House Appropriations Committee. Joe Wetzel, a Portland attorney who has campaigned vigorously on a political philosophy he likens to that of Paul Tsongas, was not invited to debate here today, but he remains very much in the race as well. Well, I would like now each of the candidates to approach their podiums, and we'll begin with the opening statements. We'll begin with an opening. We'll begin with an opening statement from Harry Lonsdale, followed immediately by Mr. AuCoin. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Jim. and I want to thank the City Club of Portland for this opportunity to exercise a key part of the democratic process. Governor Roberts, fellow Oregonians, 10 or 20 years from now, I believe we'll look back on American history and say that 1992 was a landmark year, a year of great change, a year when the national pendulum began to swing back toward the people and away from the special interests. I've talked to thousands of Oregonians all across this state, from Albany to Klamath Falls to LeGrand to Portland, and there's a universal call for change. Everywhere I go, people tell me they are fed up and angry with the career politicians who've created a monumental mess in Washington and have gotten our economy way off track. And it's no wonder. In the 1980s, Congress gave us a $4 trillion national debt, gave tax breaks to the rich at the expense of the middle class, failed to provide us with a national health care plan, and created a timber crisis that is dividing us here in Oregon. Meanwhile, Congress indulged itself in a fat pay raise, voted for by Congressman AuCoin. They raised the legalized bribery known as PAC contributions to new heights, and they abused one perk after another, from sending political junk mail at taxpayer expense to the House bank and those thousands of bounced checks. It's time to bounce Congress, not checks. So if there's so much of a mess in Washington, why am I optimistic? Because I believe we've reached the point where Americans have had enough. They know the status quo isn't working for them. They know the special interests have gained control of the country through their lobbyists and PAC contributions to incumbents, and they're ready to throw the rascals out. From Maryland to Illinois, it's already happening. Now more than ever, we need leaders with courage to stand up to the special interests, courage to tell the truth even if it's politically unpopular, courage to propose serious solutions to the serious problems that face our state and our nation. Let me tell you what I stand for. I stand for an Oregon that is united, not divided. I stand for a total ban on raw log exports. I stand for a 50% cut in the defense budget over 5 years, and for using those savings to put Americans to work rebuilding our economy. I stand for tax fairness. I stand for getting the money out of politics. And I put my positions in writing in this blueprint for change. There's a copy here, plenty of copies outside. It describes my positions on the economy, health care, education, the environment, and the other major issues of the day. This is what I stand for. I offer it to the working men and women of Oregon, and I seek your comments. But now comes Congressman Les AuCoin, a 9-term congressman, posing as an outsider and a champion of change. Congressman AuCoin has raked in over $2 million in special interest campaign contributions during his 17 years. $2 million. That's a lot of debts to repay. And he's personally pocketed more than $100,000 worth of speaking fees and free vacations. He voted for both the 1981 and the 1986 Tax Acts, the guts of Reaganomics, which collectively reduced taxes on the rich from 70% to about 30%. Congressman AuCoin and his good friend in the Senate, Mark Hatfield, collaborated in creating a crisis in every timber-dependent town in our state while decimating our national forests. He accepted $13,000 from the makers of the B-2 bomber, voted for the B-2, and then posed as a champion of peace. And on top of all that, he bounced $61,000 worth of checks drawn on the House bank over a 3-year period. Congressman AuCoin can't balance his own checkbook, but he wants a promotion so that he can go to work balancing our nation's checkbook. No, Congressman AuCoin, you're not the agent of change. You represent the status quo and the bankrupt and discredited ways of the past. You and Bob Packwood have had your chance, and you flunked the course. I believe that Oregonians are ready for real change, and for that I offer my candidacy. While Congressman AuCoin and his buddies have been back in Washington making us the largest debtor nation in the world, I created a successful high-tech company. It's now grown into 4 companies in Bend. I've met a payroll twice a month for 17 years and have helped create over 100 jobs and diversify the Oregon economy. I don't believe that Oregon voters are going to accept the slow unraveling of the American dream. I'm convinced that on May 19th, they're going to go to the polls and vote for real change. This election is about the special interests versus the people of Oregon, and the people of Oregon are going to win.
Your time has
We're going to
expired,
take
Mr.
our
Lonsdale.
country back. Thank you.
I want to talk about the direction of America and the stakes in this election. There's no better place to begin than with the end of the Cold War. It's a perfect symbol for where we stand today as a nation, at the end of a long twilight struggle, yet facing new struggles here at home. But before turning to the Cold War, I'd like for a moment to comment on my opponent's war of words. The unfortunate reality of politics today, my friends, is that it's become a shooting gallery, a killing field. I call it accusation politics. It's so much easier to grab headlines by character assassinations than it is to do the real work of thinking through our problems, finding solutions, and leading our nation forward. And I think that's why the public is so angry today. You know, Harry, in the last debate, both of us went too far down that road. Rather than discussing what we have to offer to make America work better for Americans. And unfortunately, today's debate has begun on the same basis. Harry, let's pledge to do better today. This is the City Club. Let's tell the voters of this state how we intend to improve their lives and to rescue this country. I'm going to do my part, and I'd like to see you do the same. Now to the problems at hand. When I first entered public service, I was motivated by two events that shaped my view of the world: the struggle for civil rights and the tragedy of Vietnam. It's from those events that I have shaped my worldview, my belief that wrongs can be made right, and that there are times when government can and must be a force for change. Which brings us to this day. We are at a crossroads in America between the Cold War and the 21st century. History has given us a gift given to few generations, a summons not to vanquish a superpower abroad, but to conquer ignorance and disease and economic decline here at home. My candidacy is about having the guts, the leadership, and the know-how to seize this moment in history and to move our country forward. For 17 years, I've learned the details of military spending inside out. I know the weapon systems that work and those that don't, the troops that need to come home and the troops that need to stay on station. And in the United States Senate, I will challenge George Bush and the Pentagon and other members of Congress to recognize that the Cold War is over, and with that, Cold War thinking must be over as well. My proposal is to cut 60% out of military spending over the next 5 years. That will save $1.1 trillion that we can invest to rebuild America. Part of that savings needs to be used to rebuild the schools of our country. I've detailed in this campaign a dramatic $100 billion a year commitment to quality public schools. Nothing, absolutely nothing, is more important for our future. I proposed a new commitment to savings and creating jobs, a plan to revamp our health care system to control costs, make health care affordable and available, a middle-income tax cut to correct the tax sins of the 1980s. And I want to tell you this. I also stand for the passage of a Freedom of Choice Act to give all American women the reproductive rights they deserve for once and for all. None of these solutions are going to be easy. None are without costs. But they are what I believe and what this election is really all about. I began this campaign 11 months ago, quoting Wayne Morse. And I'd like to end my remarks by quoting him once again. Wayne Morse wrote, "One great cancer in American life is that politicians don't enter fights, don't battle for policies, unless they believe they can win. I believe," he continued, "that great good can be accomplished by entering fights and espousing principles, even if they will, at the moment, be unsuccessful. Defense contractors, the gun lobby, the anti-choice mob,
Your time has expired.
these and more I have fought unsuccessfully at first, successfully in the end, and on those values I intend to lead and to win in the United States Senate."
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll now move on to the portion of our program consisting of questions from our City Club panel, and I'll turn the program over to the panelists, Mary McWilliams and Bill Crane. Each candidate will have 1 minute to respond to the question asked, after which the other candidate will also have 1 minute to rebut, and our timekeeper again will keep the time on this. The first question is for Mr. Lonsdale from Mary McWilliams.
Mr. Lonsdale, federal entitlement programs like Medicare and Social Security are consuming more and more of the federal budget. Should the Social Security system continue to be an entitlement program, or should it be changed to a needs-based program?
Good question. I believe we should keep the system pretty much intact the way it is. People have, as you know, paid into their FICA accounts for many, many years, and they've earned that. They've earned a repayment on that investment in their retirement. So I would say certainly that part, the Social Security part of the entitlement program, should stay the way it is. We do have a major national debt, though, as you know. We're adding up, what was it, $1 billion in debt every day in this country. This could be the largest deficit in our nation's history, almost $400 billion this year, and we may need some way to extract more taxes from the rich. That is, people who are collecting 2 or 3 or 4 retirement checks may be able to contribute more to their to the federal treasury.
Well, I'm not sure I understood Harry's comment, but let me just tell you what I think of Social Security and how it ought to be treated. This is a compact. It's a compact between generations, and I believe it's sacrosanct. Needs to remain sacrosanct. I don't believe it ought to be, quote unquote, pretty much kept intact. I think it ought to be absolutely kept intact. Some have suggested, and I don't know whether that's what Harry meant or not, that you take the non-pension part of Social Security and you subject that to the regular budgeting process. The only difficulty I have with that is that with the firewalls that are separating military spending and protecting it against domestic spending, the budget crunch is crunching approach, and that will not happen on my watch.
Willingness for the United States to continue in the world. What defense foreign policies would you advocate that the United States pursue now?
Well, I think what we need is a significant retailoring and retooling of our defense forces. And here's where my battle with George Bush is very fundamental. You know, to design a defense budget, you have to have what they call a defense guidance. It's an assessment of where the threats and where the risks are to our country, given the world that we face. It's a new world. There are new threats. It's not absent of threats, and we need to design our forces in order to face them. I think that if we pull our troops out of Western Europe, stop defending the Western Europeans from a Warsaw Pact which no longer exists, and use those funds to rebuild the American economy, we will be more secure as a country. I think that we ought to eliminate Star Wars. We ought to invest in conventional, highly mobile, highly trained units that can respond to crises where they develop. Now, George Bush's plan is simply this: he designs his budget on the basis of fighting three 3 desert storms, 1 Panamanian invasion, and the ability for the United States to send an expeditionary force to Lithuania to protect Lithuanians from Russia. I think that's fantasy.
Mr. Lonsdale?
Thank you. Congressman AuCoin is now saying he wants to cut the military budget by 60%. A few weeks ago it was over 8 years. Now it seems to be over 5 years. But in fact, just 2 years ago in the U.S. House of Representatives, he voted against reducing military expenditures by even 5%. So I wonder where the consistency is in that. My plan, of course, is spelled out in this blueprint for change, and I believe we should bring American troops home from those overseas bases where they're no longer needed and leave American troops only in the few hot spots that remain in the world. We should, in fact, cut the military budget in a major way. We should reduce our nuclear arsenals in tandem with the Soviet Union. I once saw an atomic bomb go off in Nevada when I was in the Air Force. It was a life-changing experience for me. We've got to somehow reduce those nuclear arsenals in a major way, jointly with the former Soviet Union. And we need an international inspection team to make sure that no one else in the world builds an atomic bomb behind our back. And I think we do that through the United Nations. That's my plan.
Does your position on refusing PAC funds mean that you oppose allowing people of modest means to pool their contributions for candidates, or do you believe only wealthy people should run for office?
I wish I were wealthy. As you may know, I've spent most of my life savings trying to defeat Senator Mark Hatfield in 1990. I wouldn't want to take the rights of private citizens away. The key question is pooling. If people want to contribute to candidates, they're most welcome to do so, and they can write them a $5 check, a $100 check, or even a $1,000 check. The difficulty is in the pooling, because when PACs make $5,000 contributions to my opponent, for example, they want something back for that, and they frequently get it. That whole system, in my opinion, is corrupt, and it's getting more corrupt every election cycle. I think Congressman AuCoin in the last 10 years has had something like 70% of his contributions from political action committees, and they want something back for that. In my company, we never took money, put it on the table, and burned it. And when those PACs give money to my opponent, they're wanting something back in return, and sometimes they get it, as they did on the B-2 bomber. We simply got to get that special interest money out of politics if we're ever going to get our country back on track again.
Mr. AuCoin?
Well, Harry has a 2-step process for campaign finance reform. Step 1 is to become a millionaire. Step 2 is to write a check to your own campaign. Regrettably, most Americans don't have the opportunity to do that, and I think that, but more than that, I think we ought to be very careful before we curtail all PAC contributions. Working people have a hard time networking with themselves like corporation boardroom members to pool their resources and have a voice in politics. But I'm going to tell you something, Harry. I have listened to you throughout these months attacking my character and developing a cause and effect relationship without any proof and any evidence. And I want to tell you something today. I'm not going to stand here and let you impugn my integrity. The people of this state, the people of this club know that I have offered service and integrity from light rail to a woman's right to choose, and that's my record, and there's nothing you can say to change that. You should be ashamed of, as a scientist, of that kind of cause and effect relationship.
Why did you decide to give up your seniority and status in the House as well as your seat on the Appropriations Committee to try to become a junior member of the Senate?
Well, let me just be very candid with you and tell you that that's not a decision that one comes to lightly. I'm proud of what I've achieved as a member of the Appropriations Committee for this city, for this state. Light rail is here in Portland, making one of the most livable cities in this state because of the work I've done in the House. The Columbia River Gorge Scenic Protection Act is there for the same reason, because of my work. We've turned the House from a anti-choice Henry Hyde tyranny into a pro-choice majority. But I want to tell you why I wanted to go to the Senate. Because there, you do not see the giants that you used to see. You don't see the leadership you used to see. There, if anyone watched the Clarence Thomas hearings, you know what I'm talking about. Whether it's either side of the aisle, what we've got people there that seem to be clueless about what the great issues are in this country and unable to be angry about injustice when it's so clearly on display. I want to not join the Senate. I want to move the Senate, and now's the time to do just that.
Mr. Lonsdale.
Well, I too am saddened that Congressman AuCoin gave up a virtually sure first congressional seat to but in fact his record, of course, in the House of Representatives has not been particularly laudable at all, in my opinion. Mr. AuCoin likes to take credit for bringing us light rail, and in 1990, I guess we heard repeatedly that Senator Hatfield had brought us the light rail. A lot of people seem to want to take credit for bringing us light rail. What I think Congressman AuCoin has brought us is a timber crisis throughout our state. I've traveled, perhaps it's not so noticeable here in Portland, but throughout our state, those timber-dependent towns are angry and they're afraid. They've seen their jobs disappear by the tens of thousands, while Congressman AuCoin and his colleagues in the Congress have allowed raw log exports by the billions of board feet to go to Japan and our trading partners. That's the main thing that I see that Congressman AuCoin has brought this state in his 17 years in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Mr. Lonsdale, do you support loan guarantees to Israel? And would you please explain your answer?
Sure. My answer is, first of all, I do not support loan guarantees. If you're talking about loan guarantees for settlements in the West Bank, my answer is no. I've lived in Israel for some time. My kids worked on a kibbutz there. This is like 17 or 18 years ago, and I have a number of friends in Israel, and I'll hope to remain friends with them for the rest of my life. And I continue to correspond with my friends in Israel. I consider myself a strong defender of Israel. We must maintain Israel's right to exist because, in fact, they are surrounded by some people who don't want them to exist. But I don't believe it's our job to maintain settlements in the West Bank. My feeling is that's something for the Israelis and their Arab neighbors to work out. I strongly support them sitting down with their neighbors and working out a lasting and secure peace for both sides. But I don't think that settlements in the West Bank have anything to do with that security process.
Mr. AuCoin?
Well, I don't support the settlements in the West Bank either, but you know, this is an important question because it's how do democracies and friends deal with each other? The United States has agreed to loan guarantees to China, to Iraq, to Jordan, to Yemen, without any conditions whatsoever. And for the United States now to say to Israel at a time that should be great joy because of the Soviet absorption of Soviet immigrants, something I have fought for most of my political career, to say that we will deny loan guarantees to accommodate those immigrants, I think, and attaching conditionality to it, I think it's fundamentally wrong on the basis of it. But secondly, it plays into the hands of the hardest line elements of the Israeli government, and I think that is fundamentally counterproductive, and I have a fundamental difference with my opponent on that issue.
Mr. AuCoin, next question. Had you been chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee last year, how would you have conducted the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings?
Well, a lot better. You know, I can't stand here and say what I would have done precisely when the allegations of sexual harassment arose. I do think they needed to be investigated. I can't spontaneously say what the precise manner in which that investigation should have taken place should have been. But I want to tell you this. I would have been tenacious, notwithstanding race, I would have been tenacious in going after this nominee's ideas about judicial philosophy. At a time when Roe v. Wade is hanging by a thread, it is important for the Senate of the United States to demand to know what the basic philosophical principles a nominee brings forward. And if a nominee wants to stonewall and only tell us after he or she puts on their robes, I think the Senate, exercising its advise and consent role, ought to say, no good, not good enough. You come back when you're wanting to talk to us.
Mr. Lonsdale.
Thanks, Bill. I'm not sure that Congressman AuCoin told us how he would have voted, but I'll tell you how I would have voted. I would have certainly voted against the confirmation of Clarence Thomas. When President Bush said that this man was the best qualified man for the Supreme Court, I think even his nose lengthened a couple of inches on that one. He certainly wasn't qualified to serve on the court at all, point one. Point two, I felt that Anita Hill was grossly abused in those hearings, and had I been the chairman, I would have defended her right to propriety, her right to her own privacy, and not allowed the Republicans on that committee to abuse her as they did. I felt very strongly. I felt sufficiently strongly for her that, in fact, I wrote her a very conciliatory letter shortly after those hearings saying that she was a heroine to me and she will remain a heroine to me.
Thank you both. If you thought that was a lively session, now the fun begins because we have the questions for the candidates from each other. During this portion of the program, each candidate will ask 3 questions of his opponent, and the question must be asked in 30 seconds. The opponent will have 1 minute to respond, and then the questioner will have 30 seconds for a rebuttal. The role of the questioner will alternate between the candidates. We begin with a question from Mr. Lonsdale to Mr. AuCoin.
Mr. Congressman, this check bouncing scandal just won't go away. It's in today's paper again. You've admitted to bouncing 80 checks for $61,000 over a 3-year period, and now it appears to be even more. And there are lots of questions like, did you make interest-free loans to yourself? You could clear all of that up by releasing your house bank records for your 17 years in the House. Will you release those records, yes or no?
Harry, you know, this just brings me back to the point I made at the beginning. Accusation politics. You can't help yourself, can you? You just can't stop. You know, and here's a man who promised to release his taxes and then failed to keep his promise. My taxes, my checks, my financial information is more disclosed than any other candidate for this office. But let me just tell you this. I have been more forthright in coming forward the instant I knew I had any difficulties of this kind. I told the people of Oregon at every step along the way what those difficulties were. My opponent wants to make this a referendum on checkbooks, but you know something? I think this election, because this issue will subside, this election is a referendum on the future of the United States of America and our ability to survive as a superpower and as a great power. And the ideas of our candidates should be what this referendum is all about. I think I have the answers. Harry Lonsdale has the accusation politics.
I didn't hear a yes or a no in that. I'm afraid maybe the audience did, but I must have missed it. We'd still like to know, Congressman, you did in fact bounce all those checks. You're one of the major abusers of the House bank in the House of Representatives, and we Oregonians would like to know what was going on back there. Were these in fact interest-free loans? And you made some comment to my releasing my information. Congressman, as you well know, I've released everything that the federal government requires the candidates to release. We did it promptly and we did it thoroughly.
Harry, I've spent a lot of time thinking about and working on the issue of national defense, where cuts can be made and what's needed in making them to protect our country. The way those decisions are made is something I referred to a moment ago. It's through a threat assessment, to assess where the threats are, and then you build a budget around them. You've called for a 50% cut in military spending. Leaving aside the specific cuts in weapon systems, what are the threats as you look at the world as it emerges from the Cold War, the threats you see out there in the world which enables you to arrive at the number 50%? Describe those threats, if you would.
Well, Congressman, you've of course talked about a 60% tax cut and a defense budget cut, and I guess I'd ask you the same question, but let me respond. There are still threats out there, mostly terrorist threats and threats from puppet dictators like Saddam Hussein. The major threat, as we all know in this room, disappeared when Mr. Gorbachev came to power or when the Berlin Wall came down, or certainly with the dissolution of the Soviet Union a few months ago. So the major threat is gone, and this is the time to change the direction of our country in a major way. I would take those major defense contractors, and some of the brightest physicists and engineers in this country work for those defense contractors, and develop the products of the future that are going to make our country economically strong, bring back our troops from overseas bases where they're no longer needed, and stop the development and production of those unnecessary and very sophisticated and expensive weapon systems like Star Wars, the B-2 bomber for which you voted, the MX missile, and the other things that we no longer need as we drive toward a real peaceful world.
Well, Harry, let me correct you on the B-2. I have a letter available to you and to any member of this audience that thanks me for playing the instrumental role in killing the B-2 bomber. So let's just lay that aside. But what I've talked about is a threat assessment. What the threats are to the world that enables us to base a defense budget on any number, any size of a cut. I believe that you've described a few parts of the threat, but the threat doesn't add up to a 50% cut. It looks to me like a number pulled out of thin air. I want to tell you where my focus is. Bring all of the troops home from Europe. Bring them home from the Pacific. Design forces here in the United States that are highly mobile, highly trained, be able to address emergency attacks where they may be, and to reject this defense guidance by the Bush administration, which is so obviously out of touch with post-Cold War thinking.
Mr. Congressman, while I was running Bend Research, we never put money on the table and burned it. We were either buying something with it or giving it to charity. During your 17 years in Congress, you've taken over $2 million in PAC money, making you the 5th highest PAC recipient in Congress. That's a lot of dough. What I want to know is, why are the special interest PACs giving you all that cash, and why are you taking it?
Harry, I have 4,000 individual Oregonians who have contributed to my campaign, which is a number far in excess of the support you've been able to get out of the grassroots from this state, and that's a point that needs to be stated in this debate. Secondly, one of the reasons why releasing your taxes, which you promised to do but which you failed to do, which I promise I've kept, is that if you're going to fund your own campaign, I think the public needs to know the source on which the business transactions you're engaged in that enables you to, in fact, fund your campaign. So let me just say that acquisition politics, tax on integrity, all the rest, you can do that if you want. But I just don't think it is fair to say that there's a cause and effect relationship between these things when you have no proof. You know, when I vote for the minimum wage, I don't do that because the AFL-CIO told me to. I vote for the minimum wage because I believe the minimum wage is needed for the American people.
Congressman, we private citizens back here have gotten sick and tired of asking this question and getting a non-answer. It's sort of this two ships crossing in the night. My question, sir, was why do the special interest PACs give you all that cash, more than $2.25 million of it, and why do you take it? And while I can't prove that you sold your vote on the B-2 bomber, the evidence is awfully convincing to me, sir, and I think it would be to anyone who's actually checked the record. Why do you take it? Why do they give it? We want the answer to that question, Congressman.
Well, Harry, I'm glad you said you can't prove it. I would then have to say, why do you allege it? You know, my opponent is consistently...
Your question time is running, Mr. AuCoin.
Is it my question?
To Mr. Lonsdale? Yes.
My question to him?
Yes.
Harry, you've said repeatedly that you do not support federal funding for primary and secondary education. This week I noticed in the Oregonian that the Portland School Board held a hearing outlining the cuts that they have to make as a result of ballot measure number 5. Slashing child care, eliminating schools for the homeless, the students at risk program, teen parenting programs, and more. Not just Portland. With lives of our kids on the balance, why do you continue to say the peace dividend should not be used for a fundamental federal commitment to our public schools as an equal partner with state and local governments?
Congressman AuCoin, if you read my blueprint for change at all, you realize that I'm not opposed to federal help for education. I believe in substantial federal help to education. There already is some, and we need more. The question is, how do we do it? Do we somehow have the federal government control our local schools? I don't think so. The way I would do it is to continue or reinstitute block grants and federal revenue sharing that we had in the 1970s back to the states, so that Governor Roberts will have some more money to use to support our school districts in this state, not to have the federal government take over our schools.
You know, when I was in the legislature, I worked very hard for state basic school support, and one of the problems is that basic school support has been reduced over the last several years. And no one I knew then said that because basic school support was rising when we did achieve an increase, meant that the state was taking over our schools. It meant that the state was stepping up and meeting its responsibility. We have a changed world. A unified European economy in January 1st of 1993, new economic threats out of the Pacific Rim, and I'm saying it's time for the federal government not to control our schools, but to step up with its responsibility to help us finance a quality education and a high-skilled, high-performance workforce in the 21st century.
Thank you. Mr. Congressman, you voted for Reaganomics on all three occasions when it really mattered: the 81 Tax Act, the 86 Tax Act, and the 1990 Bush budget. Those tax bills did more to help the rich and hurt the working people of Oregon than any other bill passed in the last generation. What is your explanation for supporting such unfair taxation 3 times?
Harry, accusation politics, and you're just fundamentally wrong.
It's your voting
In
record, Congressman.
1981, I opposed on the key vote on the Reagan tax cut. I opposed that, and I fought it tooth and nail. And no group in the state of Oregon knows that better than the City Club, because the City Club throughout the decade of the 80s remembers me standing at this podium campaigning against Reagan robots who were vilifying my record for opposing Ronald Reagan in his 1981 tax bill. So I don't know if you were here then, Harry, but if you were, you forgot. Now, in the 86 tax bill, at least had some things in it. One vote, no chance to amend. Some things in it I didn't like, some things I did like. One thing I did like was this. It removed some of the most egregious giveaways to corporate America. The ability of unprofitable corporations to sell their tax losses to profitable corporations, so that both would be able to escape taxation. I think that was an egregious mistake, and for that reason I voted for the 86 tax bill, and am working to change the problems that were built into the 86 tax bill. But that fundamental change was needed to roll back the excesses of the 1980s.
Got a lot to talk about. I think the congressman's nose is starting to get lengthened now. Congressman, I have in front of me from the Congressional record, July 29th, 1981, your vote on the 1981 tax cut. And if you're Congressman AuCoin from Oregon, you voted for the final version, sir, so I'd like to correct that for the record. The 1986 Tax Act was another major disaster, and as you pointed out just recently, Congressman, you're now trying to correct the worst part of that disaster by taxing unemployment benefits, something that should never have been done in the first place. Now you want to undo what you did by a huge mistake back in 1986. Congressman, you've got to make up your mind on those. In the 1990 Tax Act, you voted to cut $60 billion from Medicare. What do you stand for, sir?
Well, Harry, I want to tell you that my voting record with the United Seniors of Oregon
Mr. Coyne, this is your question period.
is 87%. Now let me get to my question of you, and I just have to leave aside some of the slurs given the format we're in. Over the past decade, Harry, Reagan and Bush and their administrations have attempted to increase the interest rates on BPA on its debt repayment schedule. That would cost millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on our ratepayers. I fought and won to defeat those rate increases. Now the administration is getting more aggressive, and some have suggested we ought to pass permanent legislation to lock in place those rates as they are, so we're not subjecting ourselves to the annual threat through the appropriations process. Would you support such legislation for utility payers?
Well, again, we're hearing sort of two people taking credit for locking in the BPA rates. Last time it was Senator Hatfield, this time it's Congressman AuCoin. Everyone seems to want to take credit for the good things that happened to our state. My answer, Congressman, is that I would agree to lock in those rates or make something that's certainly safe for Oregon's future, Oregon and the Pacific Northwest future, and locking in those rates is probably the safest thing to do. We don't want to have Reagan and Bush presidents, whoever it might be in the future, dictating those rates to us and perhaps driving up local rates and increasing sort of decreasing the economics of this entire region by doing so.
Well, Harry, you know, the problem with that is that it's, and some of my colleagues are guilty of this too, it's good intentions, but I'm afraid it would have consequences that would be very punitive to the people of the Northwest. To do that, rather than to fight in the Appropriations Committee, would mean you'd have to put a permanent bill, before a committee of 535 members of Congress that come from areas outside this region who are jealous of our low electrical rates. And if you put that bill and try to move it through the Congress, what you're going to do is have a temptation on the part of everyone else to nationalize rates in the Northwest and produce exactly what you want to avoid. So I think that's the problem between good intentions and not really understanding how you can shoot yourself in the foot when you're trying to pursue those good intentions.
Our time for the questions of the candidates has expired. We'll move on now to a return to the City Club panelists for the final questioning in this debate. As before, the candidate will have 1 minute to respond to each question, and the opponent will have 1 minute to rebut. We begin with Mary McWilliams and a question for Mr. Lonsdale.
I'm going to switch hats with Bill Crane to ask Mr. Lonsdale next.
Mr. Lonsdale, you're running for the U.S. Senate with an anti-incumbency campaign message. What impacts do you think highly negative campaigns have on the widening rift between the electorate and their government?
Bill, you imply that I'm running a negative campaign, I believe, and I don't believe that I'm doing that. What I have here is Congressman AuCoin's record, and it's voluminous, and it's, in my opinion, not particularly good for Oregon or the Pacific Northwest. I mean, he did vote for those tax cuts, which in fact have destroyed our economy, allowed the rich to get richer, put the entire burden of taxes on the middle class, and made more poor people in this country. So it is an anti-incumbent mood for sure. This country is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. These people in this audience didn't vote for it. I didn't vote for it. It's Congressman AuCoin and his colleagues in the Congress that have voted for it. Congressional popularity in this country is at an all-time low. The New York Times did a poll just recently that said only 17% of Americans think Congress is doing a good job. 75% think they're doing a poor job, and I think most of us in this room would be in that 75%. They are doing a poor job. It's time for turnover, and I believe 1992 will be that year of turnover. Americans are demanding change in Congress.
Mr. AuCoin.
You know, I'm not here to defend any incumbents. I'm not here to defend the President of the United States, the Democratic leadership. I'm just here to suggest to this club, which I think has a long memory, that I have been a part of the solution, not part of the problem. It was my work, effective work, that brought light rail to the west side of the city and to the east side and to the west side of the city. It was my work that produced thousands of jobs of ship repair work in the shipyards of this state when the Pentagon wanted to keep us out of our bidding. It was my work that helped move through the House the Brady Bill with a 7-day waiting period. And it was my work, effective work, over the course of 5 years that turned the House of Representatives from a Henry Hyde tyranny into a pro-choice majority. And it was my work that brought to Oregon and to Portland Nehemiah housing in some of the areas that need housing more than anywhere else, and youth gang programs to stop this sickness that we see in our streets, which are killing our kids. You talk about killing fields, they're right here in the streets of Portland. I think that's effectiveness, and I think that kind of effectiveness belongs in the Senate of the United States.
Mr. AuCoin. Next question for Mr. AuCoin. How do you propose to provide health care for people who need it at a cost this country can afford without creating another huge administrative bureaucracy?
I support a single-payer system of health care delivery in this country, a top-to-bottom reform of our delivery system. It should be a single-payer system because what that would do, according to the GAO, the General Accounting Office, would be to save $70 billion a year in wasted paperwork that's now being shuffled between insurers, 1,500 of them around the country, clients, and medical offices. That $70 billion could go into preventive care, prenatal care, those sorts of things. Under the single-payer system I support, we would be able to extend health care, and I'm the only person suggesting this in the Senate race, health care to our elderly for long-term health care, nursing homes or home health care, and prescription drugs. You know, I met a woman campaigning for this race who is a widow, a senior widow, and she's spending 2/3 of her income a month on prescription drugs. My program stops that, and I say that kind of thing should not happen in America, and my program is the one that provides an answer to that problem.
Mr. Lonsdale.
Thank you. Well, I share the Congressman's concern about the elderly and the people in this country who don't have medical insurance and suffer the great fear of being wiped out financially with a catastrophic illness. I, too, believe in universal health coverage for every American, prenatal to grave. We've simply got to do it. Every industrialized country in the world does it, but the United States, we've simply got to get on with that program. But Congressman AuCoin has been back there for 17 years. He's never done one thing, as far as I can tell, to make that happen. We've needed it for a long time. I've seen no leadership from Congressman AuCoin on that subject whatsoever. He tells us about the wonders of the single-payer plan. What he doesn't tell us is who's going to pay for it. In Canada, where they have the single-payer plan, they have substantially higher taxes, personal income taxes, to pay for it. I would keep much of the tax burden in this country on the backs of employers. When we started our company in Bend, we provided health insurance for every employee in the company, even before I began to draw a paycheck. We felt it was that important to our employees to do so. Questions are, how do we control costs, and who pays for the system?
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll now have a 3-minute summation from each candidate, beginning with Mr. Lonsdale.
Thank you, Jim. This great country of ours is divided. We're divided between the rich and poor. We're divided between labor and management. Sadly, the division between the races is on the increase. And here in Oregon, we're divided between timber workers and environmentalists. And we're $4 trillion in debt. That's $60,000 of debt for every American family. And it's growing at the rate of $1 billion a day. And what's sad about all this is that this should be a time of rejoicing. With the end of the Cold War, we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to create a lasting peace throughout the world. Sometimes it's even hard to remember the meaning of the words, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now we have 9-term Congressman Les AuCoin, the would-be outsider. In his TV ads, he's even dropped his title of congressman, and he's just plain friendly Les. Well, Mr. Congressman, let's look at your record. You voted for Reaganomics right down the line. You voted for the 81 tax package, even though you now want to deny it, and the 86 tax package and the 90 tax package. You voted to build more B-2 bombers long after most of Congress abandoned the project, but only shortly after pocketing thousands of dollars from the folks who build the B-2. I remember well sitting on the board of the Oregon Peace Institute when the president of the institute asked for your resignation from the board because of your B-2 vote, and you resigned. And now you say you want to cut defense spending by 60%, but just 2 years ago you voted against cutting it by only 5%. You helped create a timber crisis all across our state by mandating excessive timber cut levels while taking over $100,000 into timber interests, bypassing environmental laws, and allowing massive raw log exports to Japan. No, Congressman, you aren't the agent of change. You and your buddies in Congress have divided our state and our country. But I believe that this unhappy chapter in American history will have a happy ending. Many career politicians are packing it in and not running again, and many others will be defeated in the fall. This is the year, friends, when we begin to take our country back from the career politicians and the special interests. We can't fix it overnight, but as John Kennedy said, let us begin. My plan for getting America back on track is contained in this blueprint for change. In it, I describe the economic conversion we need from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy, and a workable universal health care plan, a plan for real campaign finance reform, and more. But let me close with this thought. Those who believe the country is on the right track should vote for incumbents like Congressman AuCoin and Senator Packwood. You're sure to get more of the same. But those who believe we can do better, who want to get this country back on track, must vote for change on May 19th. Thank you all very much.
First, I'd like to take a moment to thank the City Club for hosting this debate today, to the panelists for their questions and their participation, and to the audience for its participation and questions as well. And I'd like to end this debate on a personal note. As many of you know, I grew up over in Central Oregon in Redmond. My mother raised our family on her own as a waitress with $35 a week in wages. And sometimes, we struggle to make ends meet. But along with the hard work and the long hours, there was always a sense of hope that better days would come. It's that optimism that, more than anything else, that drives my commitment and the changes I have brought to this state to lead me now to try to lead the state in the United States Senate. My belief that things can be made better by thoughtful leadership, aptly demonstrated. And it's that optimism today, regrettably, that's been so sadly shaken by the public. After a decade of greed, ushered in by Reagan, kept alive by Bush, our country has turned angry. And there are good reasons to be angry. At home, many problems remain unsolved, many needs left unmet. But as in most times of crisis, there are those who will simply want to manipulate the moment for their own narrow political benefit. That's what accusation politics, my friends, is all about. I think it's corrosive. My opponent has taken the frustration we all feel, especially those of us who have been in the trenches fighting against the changes that have been inflicted on us, and he's turned it into an indictment of our modern democracy. He's taken our anger and tried to exploit it without giving solid answers of his own. And finally, he's taken my reputation, as you saw today, and tried to destroy it. But in the end, I think my opponent misses the real meaning of the times we live in. The people of this state are not interested in lynching. They want leadership. They recognize that we are at a crossroads, and we have a historic chance with proven leadership to solve our problems and move our nation into the 21st century. They understand that it takes more than simple answers or throw the bums out rhetoric in order to bring those changes. They want leadership, and that's what I offer. Our timber crisis can be solved. Our health care costs controlled. Choice for women secured. I've demonstrated that. Jobs protected and the environment preserved. I have always been a part of the solution, and I'm proud of that fact. My fight for the Senate is to solve those problems, produce more answers that are meaningful to people throughout this state. I believe in one Oregon, not two Oregons. And I believe that we need someone in the Senate, and I intend to be that person, who will build this country with a future of the kind of hope I knew in Redmond, Oregon. Thank you very much.
Our thanks to both candidates. I trust that the City Club's endeavors to keep the healthy skepticism about government from becoming the disease of cynicism has been furthered by our debate today. Thank you, AuCoin and Harry Lonsdale.